Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to welcome you today to a seminar, a webinar on converting opportunity into Indigenous prosperity. You'll know that this is a big theme with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We've been working with Indigenous friends and partners for over 15 years on trying to do what we can do to sort of clear pathways, policy pathways to make it easier for Aboriginal people to participate in the economy and to benefit from the economy on their terms. So we've got a wonderful sort of session today. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague who'll be part of the conversation today. Sandy Sanderson is the president of the Northeast Alberta Business Association, which is located in Fort McMurray, Alberta. Although Sandy's calling us today from Sherwood Park. This organization advocates for Indigenous businesses in the northeastern part of the province of Alberta, focusing very much on ensuring that the rights of Indigenous people are respected by oil sands developers. Sandy is a proud member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation, which has a staggeringly remarkable record for engaging in the oil and gas sector and in the economy generally on its own terms, that I think is an important sort of element here, and has served in a whole variety of capacities and different executive positions in organizations, and is extremely well-known reputation as an advocate for Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So Sandy, thank you very, very much for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Ken. It's always a pleasure.
So Sandy, I want to ask you something as a starting point, and we've got a series of questions that have been asked by our people who signed up. They sent them in. I'll fold those into my questions kind of as seamlessly as I possibly can. Those of you who joined us online, delighted to have you with us. If you sort of send a message in through the chat, it'll pop up on my screen. I'll have a chance to add it to the conversation if we get the opportunity. So please let us know if you have any questions as we go along. And I just will tell you that we will end precisely on the hour, respecting your time and particularly Sandy's time in this particular occasion. So Sandy, I want to just ask you this question. If you were to ask the average person in Canada, or Germany for that matter, or the United States, they would say that Indigenous people oppose the development of oil sands. That Aboriginal people have been colonized and marginalized and abused, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you describe the Indigenous reaction in Northern Alberta to the oil and gas sector?
You know, Ken, I think that's so far from the truth. I think that when you look at actually the sector, you're going to find that actually the Indigenous people are probably the most motivated of this resource sector in terms of what it brings and what opportunities it brings. You know, of course, we're dealing with Indigenous people that have dealt with, having their treaty rights ignored. So, in the absence of failed honored treaty and rights, the resource sector of oil and gas has brought a ton of opportunity for us. I look at, where we are now and in our communities, we see levels of interdependence, education. I was afforded an opportunity to go to post-secondary because my nation had a group of companies, and they invested into the people to grow. We look at entrepreneurship. It just doesn't fall on your lap. Our culture, ATC is, the Athabasca Tribal Council has a huge event coming up in September. And so I would say that's far from the truth. I think what happens is that when we start looking at where governments get involved in process and how things get spun out of hands, it gets perceived that it's that way. I think there's that. We're also dealing with histories of, systemic racism and people working off an old playbook. Which really isn't present in terms of where we are today. So I think it's far from the truth. And like I said, you're going to find that Indigenous people are definitely the most motivated in terms of working with resource companies.
That's so neat. We're going to come back and talk about that motivation and sort of motivated to do what, sort of a bit down the line. So what are Indigenous communities hoping to get out of their involvement in the oil and gas sector? But I want to sort of start with something that I find really interesting. I don't know if you know, but I'm an historian by training, and I've done work on the history of the fur trade in the Canadian North for a very, very long time. One of the things I find really fascinating is that people think that entrepreneurship among Indigenous people is a new thing. That it's the latest thing that that Europeans and white people have taught Aboriginal people to do. You know that in Northern Alberta, it's one of the most active trading zones in the country long before the Europeans arrived. So entrepreneurship is kind of natural, isn't it?
It is. It is. I think, years ago, we were all in a classroom and told that, Christopher Columbus discovered, the Americas. And we're led to believe that for a number of years. And, I think there was a belief that, as Indigenous people, we were just standing around doing absolutely nothing. It was far from the fact in terms of the sophistication of the lifestyle, the trading, the cultures, the languages, the respect for Mother Earth, working together, so it's and I think what's happening over the last, few years is people are recognizing to say, well, geez, you have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And we really didn't have a lot of history in terms of understanding that. And so I think we're all as much as, we talk about, being misinformed in the classroom, there's also non-Aboriginal people that were affected and led to believe this as well too, which is what we have in terms of people that are in Canada who are also struggling to understand and learn, the history of Indigenous people, the history of rights. And we've dealt with, a government that has kind of dragged its feet in terms of honoring those rights, even right from, UNDRIP, which, we can talk about more later, because I think that's an important component as well.
Yeah, so UNDRIP, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it's provided a sort of a much broader context for what governments should be working on with their Indigenous friends and nations. One more sort of historical thing I want to be in mind, because I first time I went to Northern Alberta was sort of in the 1960s. My father drove me up there for a while. And I was raised in the Yukon. And interestingly, if you go back to the early 1960s, Aboriginal people in Northern Alberta were speaking the language. They were hunting and fishing on the land. There were no oil sands developments, no roads, no oil pipelines, things of that sort. And actually exercised a huge amount of autonomy. They actually lived their life the way they wanted to live it. If you jump forward 20 years, and this is before the oil sands came into effect in a major way, the language use had declined quite dramatically. Governments had stepped in, put people on reserves, brought in the welfare state, et cetera, and really, along with a whole bunch of other factors that were going on, effectively marginalized Indigenous people in their own lands. Mm-hmm. And so my guess is that that's a pretty good description of Northern Alberta.
It is. I think it's it's really interesting, Ken, when we talk about things like systemic racism and the impact it's had. I often say to people when we're in different areas, I say, you do understand that we're speaking a foreign language right now, and you'll see people kind of go, I never thought about that, and it's like, because that isn't the language that's been spoken here for thousands and thousands of years. I think the beautiful thing about our region is we have strong elders, community values. If you go to somewhere like Fort Chip, people talk about the necessity of an all-season road, but you look at the benefits and the preservation in terms of that community, in terms of where it is. It's an amazing place to go, and it's an amazing part to say, that's somewhere we can go and, be part of our culture, be part of our history, be proud of who we are. And there's definitely a lot of pride that comes from the Indigenous people.
There really is, actually. And I want to make it clear, because I think it fits into your narrative and your wonderful description of, let's just be frank about the systemic racism. We don't have to debate this anymore. We know what happened, and we know that the current Indigenous population are living with the consequences of decades of that kind of marginalization and what have you. So just really quickly, we'll stop the history lesson in a second, but I love your perspective on this. The oil sands comes along, bit of work in the 1960s, accelerates in the 70s and 80s. In most of that early time period, the Indigenous people weren't consulted at all. There was no requirement to involve, no consultations required, no partnerships required. How did Indigenous people get a place at the table? Because nobody gave it to the Indigenous people in Northern Alberta. Nobody came along and said, oh, by the way, would you like to share in the prosperity? The idea that you were marginalized as communities, people accepted that. They used to call this victims of progress.
Mm.
Progress was developing oil sands, the roads, the railways, the airports. That's progress. And Indigenous people were victims of that. They say, well, more people benefit, some people lose. What the heck, right? So how did Indigenous people get a seat at the table in the first instance?
It's a little bit. I often use an analogy of Indigenous people have a car, and at some point they were kind of thrown in the back seat, and government and industry kind of hopped in the front seat and said, "We're going to kind of drive this forward." I can probably refer to some strong leadership that we've had in the past. I think it's really important to recognize this is really where NABA got its legs. So the Northeastern Alberta Aboriginal Institution or Association really started over a cup of coffee with Indigenous entrepreneurs sitting down and saying, how can we participate in this activity? And this is back in the day where rights weren't prevalent. There was a lot of we probably were led to believe that we didn't have rights. But over the years, if we look at the region, we got to give credit to some really strong leaders in that area from industry, because they did it not because they had to, they did it because they wanted to. And what they recognized is that it was important to work with the Indigenous people in the region. We're talking about Eric Newell. You hear his name often about, being those people. Jim Carter, also a huge advocate. Most recently, Mark Little. These are people that I often say, some people get it and some people don't get it. And these were definitely people that get it because they were way ahead of their time. We fast forward to where we are now with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and recognizing treaties. It's these people were ahead of their time. And so they were really able to kind of provide opportunity to build capacity. And really, I want to stress the word opportunity, because it wasn't saying to them, okay, you can bid on this job. It was really about saying, you know what? Here, we're going to carve out a piece of work here. Show me that you've got the capacity to do this. Show me that you can do this. And you know what? We have in the region some of the greatest people, some of the hardest working people, some of the most innovative people. It's a far cry, I think, from the perspective that some people have of Indigenous people, but we are successful in what we do, and we always have been. And I think what it comes down to is just having that opportunity to continue to move forward. And as we're finding out now, it's in absolutely everybody's best interest for Indigenous people to be participating in resource development.
That's such a really good way to put it. You put it so brilliantly. The fact that the stereotypes of lazy First Nations people, throw it out the window. That they're backward looking and they're not interested in the future. Throw it out the window. The innovation you're talking about, the creativity is really strong. But I also remember, I'm really glad you talked about the companies that many, many years ago, when you were still in high school, Syncrude was trying to figure out ways to get Indigenous people, particularly at Fort Chipewyan, sort of involved in the industry. And they found when they hired Aboriginal people that they missed a lot of work, in quotation marks. Why? Well, because it was hunting season, or because there was a funeral in their family and they had to go and do something for a couple of weeks, or obligations and other things that happened. So what their innovation was to hire, for 10 people, they'd hired 30 people. And all they said to the community was, every Monday, we're going to come and pick up 10 people. And you have 10 people of the 30. They're all qualified, ready to go. You bring 10 people down there. And it worked perfectly. They had 10 people there all the time. And it became a really good part of the company itself. So I want you to sort of give people a bit of a sense of the scale we're talking about here, if you don't mind, Sandy, that again, you go back to the 80s and 90s, we celebrated when an Aboriginal person or a community bought a gas station or a convenience store or a 6-unit hotel, that they sort of bought into some of these small things. Give me a bit of an example of the kind of level of involvement you're talking about in terms of the Indigenous communities. Like for Chipewyan, I think I know the number. I want to get you to see if I've got it right. Are they getting $5 million a year in business out of the oil sands, or much more than that?
And to tell you the truth, I don't know off the top of my head in terms of how much they're getting. I think that's one of the things that we definitely should explore in terms of talking about how much is actually hitting the table. With a lot of these nations in terms of their businesses. I think that if we look at my nation, for instance, they are involved in wholly owned companies as well as joint venture companies. We are seeing young people, members, Indigenous people in director roles, VP roles. So we're definitely seeing more than just the monetary value of how much money is there. So yeah, it's it again is the landscape is really changing in terms of kind of what the rules are, and I think there's huge opportunities for us to be even doing a lot more than what it is we do, not just necessarily in that region, but we've got the opportunity to get into providing national level services. So, but yeah, if you have the number, I'd be interested to know.
Well, it's interesting because the number, I'm going to say it's 10 years ago, the number was $500 million a year of contracts. And I think it's considerably higher than that now. And it's just interesting that if you actually, again, look at where the protests have been about oil sands, it often focused for many years on Fort Chippewa. But in fact, that community's figured out a way to make it work for them, both financially, but also environmentally or whatever. So another quick question, and we're going to start going back and forth with my questions and those of the audience that we have here. So keep on your toes. Sandy, as we sort of jump from one to the other. So if you were to pick two or three of the most economically successful activities of all the things you see Indigenous groups working on in Northern Alberta, what are two of the three things that members of our audience might not have heard of?
Oh gosh, it's really interesting when people talk. I kind of get a kick out of people will talk about our oil sands and actually haven't even been to Fort McMurray and seen what it looks like. When you get into on-site, you are essentially walking into a small community in many respects. Everything from them having their own health services to ambulance, fire department, food services, roads being cleared. Then you get into the mining product, the side of things. Then you get into, pulling into the actual, extraction and processing, where it then gets pumped down to, a refining type of a state. So, we're talking about everything, in terms of the complexities of moving people in, accommodation, foods. And I think what's happened is in the past is we've seen probably a saturation of some of the areas where Indigenous people have gone in. And, I think at one time I had spoken to someone and the number was astronomical about how many Indigenous heavy equipment companies there were. And so what it is important for us is to be able to recognize, to say, what are other segments within the operation that we can pursue that there isn't any Aboriginal competition, and what new technologies can we bring to the table that is going to provide us, I like to refer to as a little bit of a moat, where we are competitive. Because at the end of the day, I'm a business owner, and with our business, I can tell you right now, I don't get the work because I'm Indigenous. I get the work because we do the best work out of anybody in the most environmental way. That is what I believe. And I think that, you're going to find a lot of Indigenous people that have businesses. It's that, this isn't charity work that we're doing up here. It's we'll go toe to toe with anybody, in terms of where we're at, in terms of level of capacity. So it's changed, but from years ago, it did start. You look at, and again, I sometimes, will look at nations and I see them, building companies and participating in it. And I think, we can't forget the fact that, they're doing this because, in most part, because, the governments aren't honoring the treaties in terms of, the resource developments with them. And what's happening is when we get to that level is we start having Indigenous, well, for instance, imagine if the Alberta government and the federal government got into businesses and we're starting to compete there, So again, you've got, sovereign nations that are participating into work development up there, but it's provided, great opportunity for us. And so we want to be able to look at what are the other segments, how can we evolve this? And part of that with NABA in terms of what we want to do is we want to keep the entrepreneurial flow going. Like, let's not just celebrate and say, hey, we've done a good job, check it off, and let's kind of go off and do something else. We got to keep feeding the entrepreneur side. And what happens is that sometimes, the work is the scope of the work becomes so huge. Sometimes, you get new people in that don't quite understand, the benefit of actually breaking some of it down.
Yeah.
We're now in a situation we probably haven't recognized, where we're ahead in other parts of the country where there's potentially a saturation of businesses up in that area that potentially might be outpricing Indigenous businesses in that area. So how do we have those discussions? How do we resolve, what it is we're doing? On one hand, we respect the fact that, corporations are there to make money, but, from our perspective, having to leave the community because you can no longer compete against an American blue chip company that's got way more money than you do doesn't make a lot of sense when we're talking about, in the spirit of reconciliation and, working together.
That's a really interesting point about balancing entrepreneurship and that private initiative, but realizing that the resource is a Alberta resource, a Canadian resource, and it therefore should be the benefit of the people in the region. So it is not just to make companies wealthy, but to make local people wealthy. I will use one really quick example, get your response to this. I was at a conference one time in Fort McMurray. You may well have been there on Aboriginal economic development in the oil sands. And somebody in the audience sort of said, well, is anybody are any Aboriginal businesses doing very well? And the person who was speaking at the time was a guy you probably knew quite well, is Chief Jim Boucher.
Oh, yeah.
Of Fort McKay First Nation, who is he's one of those leaders you're talking about, of the people who completely changed the narrative and changed everybody's expectations. So he said, well, in our community, and this is now this is probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago now. And he said, well, in this room, there are 12 millionaires from the Fort McKay First Nation. And he made them stand up one by one. And he pointed to them and said, this man has 4 helicopters. And this one over here, this one here has a welding shop. And this one here actually provides food catering to the communities, right? And he went across, and they were 12 completely different sectors. It wasn't as though they'd all gathered together and were doing one thing. They'd actually were across a whole range of activities. So I want to, Paul, from one of our audience members, asked this question of you. What needs to be done to communicate the narrative that the resource sector improves the lives of Indigenous people? So, we know the sector makes lots of money. We know the companies make lots of money. We know governments get lots of taxes. Mm-hmm. There's some jobs there. So is it actually filtering down to the community level? And how do you see that? If you went to Fort McKay, if you went to your community, how do you actually see that on the ground?
There's 2 things that jump out to me here, Ken. One is we need to get to a place where we're comfortable assessing what it is we're doing. What we've done up to this point is good, but there is another chapter of greatness. That's a line from Jim Collins' Good to Great. I think the one thing we need to do is we need to be able to, address our fears, our egos. We need to be able to ask ourselves, do we have the right people in the right seats? If I go back to that analogy of the car, is government going to get us to where we need to go? Or are we talking about an opportunity now where, a lot has changed with UNDRIP? And are we talking about now, why aren't the sovereign nations in the driver's seat, driving that forward? If we look at the current system that we've relationship we've had with the federal government, we've dealt with, systemic racism, oppression, the shelf life of it is expired, but we keep trying to kind of, watch government kind of try to drive it forward, but it just keeps pulling all of us down, and I think that, again, when I talk about Indigenous people, we're by far the most motivated to actually set a new path that benefits all of us. And I mean all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I think that's something that non-Indigenous people need to recognize, is that Indigenous sovereignty is a good thing. If you look at some strategic plans of companies in Canada, they will list UNDRIP as a threat. And I say to them, it's not a threat. It's an opportunity. Look at it as a means of actually sitting in the front seat with Indigenous and coming up with, driving where it is we need to go. Because, amongst the sovereign, Indigenous people in Canada, there's definitely a movement, and we need everybody on board if we want to be able to get to where we're going to go. But I think the biggest thing is what we need to do within that cart is we need to all understand and agree that it is possible. We can do this. We can trust, that government doesn't have to drive, the vehicle. They can still be in the car, but we've got to look at means and opportunities. One of the examples that the trends we're starting to see across Canada is identity of Indigenous people. Very similarly, we can talk about the identity of Indigenous businesses.
Yes.
We just saw the AFN came out questioning the federal government's procurement practices and with concerns that there are non-Indigenous businesses that are highly benefiting from this program. The federal government, implemented a 5% 5-year initiative a few years ago, but we need to be able to kind of stand back and look at that and to say, are we really, succeeding the way we think we're succeeding? Because when you look at the data that, and the federal government does this as well, and all the organizations, is they will report Indigenous spend, but there's got to be an asterisk there. And when you find that asterisk, it says includes joint ventures. So what's happening is that there are a lot of non-Indigenous companies that are benefiting heavily from being seen as, what is going towards Indigenous businesses. So I think for us, it's an opportunity to sit and talk about how do we benefit more from that, from a capacity perspective. We're talking, and it's all timely because, we can look at models from, we talked about, pedagogy of the oppressed with Paulo Freire. And the opportunity for oppressed people to actually liberate themselves, to take a role and kind of move forward. And I think this is a good opportunity for us in terms of kind of having that capacity to take the lead in the role in these relationships. But there's a lot of questions that we need to get together and have a conversation, because in lieu of not doing that, we're missing opportunity. And I mean all of us.
Yeah. I think your last point is really important. Indigenous success is Canadian success. And the Indigenous folks it makes no difference if you're the one who's a great entrepreneur and creates some new company and generates wealth, or if I do it. I'm a non-Indigenous person, you're an Aboriginal person, right? It doesn't make any difference. But it's good to Canada if one of us succeeds. That's the starting point. I am worried a little bit about your observation, not worried about what you said, but worried about what it represents, that we really have trouble inviting Indigenous folks into that front seat of the car.
Yeah.
And if we put them in the front seat of the car, we put them in the middle. We don't give them the steering wheel and the brakes and the gasoline, right? We give them the seat in the middle so they can watch. Yeah. And there's a sort of an implicit paternalism there, I think, that we have to really be nervous about, which I think is quite fascinating. So, we are seeing prosperity get down to the worker, to the community level. When you go to the communities like yours in Northern Alberta, the facilities are first rate. The schools are done well. The recreation centers have been properly done. But we underestimate, I think, the value of economic autonomy. And in fact, the fact that these communities are generating their own wealth and they're not waiting for Ottawa to pass judgment on their latest grant application. So,
The other thing too is just kind of getting back to, years ago when the chief kind of identified those millionaires in the group. I can honestly say that money isn't the end goal for a lot of Indigenous people. It provides opportunity to do other things. If you were to look at those 12 millionaires that they identified in that area, they do fabulous, amazing things for the community. They sponsor activities. They're giving out and lending opportunities even when the public doesn't see. And I think that goes back to understanding, an Indigenous community in terms of our social fabric. And if I can get back to, what's the essence of a community? We're used to looking after each other. And that's what we do. That's how Indigenous, communities have survived for, thousands of years, is supporting each other, even back in the day and still today, you'll see people go hunting and provide food, resources to the elderly and the sick. So I think it's that same mentality. And so, which is very different sometimes if you look at it from a capitalist perspective, where it's like, it's all about how much money you have in the bank. Well, I think in a lot of our communities, it's really about how much, these people are extending themselves to help others in the community grow.
Yep. Interesting. So Lynn asked a question that I want you to sort of address, if you don't mind. We're now talking very much about transitions, reducing our carbon footprint and things of that nature, and reducing basically the consumption of oil and gas over time. Although oil and gas are so integral to so many parts of our economy that we know it's going to continue to use at a very high level for many, many decades to come. The question that Lynn asked was, what's standing in the way of Indigenous peoples being part of the economic co-creation of a sustainable transition to oil and gas sector? So the sector is going to change. What's stopping Indigenous people from being part of it? Or what's stopping them from being in the driver's seat? Put it that way. Use your analogy.
Part of it, I'm going to say, is probably trying to look at our existing system and continue to contribute towards it. I think, when we talk about liberation of Indigenous people, it is getting into that front driving seat. And I think that, I mentioned Mark Little earlier. You go back years ago, and there was a tank farm deal that was negotiated with First Nations, an equity deal, and I think when you get those type of people that can think outside of the box, you're going to have prosperity. You're going to have, and what we don't recognize is that is a ripple effect that sets the example and tone across Canada for how other resource sectors can participate more. Now we see a pipeline, where we're seeing investment on pipeline and opportunities. And I think what's kind of holding us back a little bit is a little bit of a blanket of ignorance that we've still got some people that are kind of working off the old fabric, the old playbook. We really, we talk about, wanting to do something for Canada, wanting to do something for Alberta. Learn the histories of Indigenous people. Learn the rights of Indigenous people, because the more we can succeed with them, the better, opportunities we're going to have. If you look at again, going back to Suncor Syncrude, they've got an energy program that's almost done here. That's going to be able to use their own gas and electricity in for their operations, and also put a whole bunch of electricity on the grid. They're not doing this because it's they have to do it. They're doing this because they care about environmental as well too, from a perspective, because if they can't be environmentally conscientious, they're going to put themselves out of business. And I think, it's important for us to know and to see that as Indigenous people, because we rely on that economy. We rely on working with them, but we're also stewards as well too. You'll hear Indigenous people talk about, the responsibility. We still want to live a way of life. We have Indigenous people that do a lot of hunting, trapping, fishing. And so we are very sensitive about, the environmental impacts that take place, but we also believe that we can continue to do what we do in an environmental fashion as well too, while liberating Indigenous people. So, it's kind of a perfect storm from all over the place that we need to kind of jump on. And my fear is that I don't believe that there's a government that understands it enough to be able to pick up the ball and make this right for us. But I do understand, and I do believe, as Indigenous people, that we ought to pick up the ball, and we ought to sit down with industry and say, you know what, let's strategize together. Let's come to a plan, and then let's give some feedback or direction to governments on how they can support us to do what we need to do.
That's a radical, lovely transformation when it happens, because in fact, what happens is right now, a lot of people are waiting for the government to sort of do things for the North or for the First Nations or for the Métis communities. And what you're basically saying is it's right there. The opportunities are there in front of you. And if you grab them collectively, one of the greatest things I've seen, it means an awful lot to me, is that most of the Indigenous communities in this country are really quite small. I think the average size of a First Nation is 800 people or something like that. And 800 people don't very often get involved in $1.5 or $2 billion projects. That's an awful lot of money to come up with. And one of the things, I'm a huge fan of a group called the First Nations Major Project Coalition, but there's other groups. The Treaty 8 First Nations work together on a lot of things as well with the Métis in Northern Alberta. We realize there's actually real strength in numbers.
Huge.
That if we actually collaborate together and 5 communities and 5 or 6 or 7 active corporations all get together, all of a sudden that $1.5 billion Enbridge deal is possible. You couldn't do it. No one community can do it, but 21 can do it together, right? That
is a huge risk, is that there is so much, we look at First Nations and, they're social organizations as well, too, in terms of looking after their communities. They've got a ton on their plate in terms of, what the responsibilities and such are moving. And often what we need to, I guess, really consider is that we don't want to be, 20, 30 years down the road and say, gee, we missed that opportunity because we were overwhelmed with this and this and we missed this. I think the opportunity for collaboration, working together, and recognizing that, a little bit of this and a little bit of this adds up to a lot at the end of the day. And, and again, it's in the best interest of resource development companies and the governments to see Indigenous, succeed, again. Yeah. And I honestly believe, I'm a big believer that, what is it? The donkey or the horse pulls the economic or the social cart, because, Indigenous people do have their eye. It's not primarily just on money. We do have our eye on homeless people. Why do we have a high number of homeless people? What's the incarceration level of people in prison that are Indigenous? Like, we've got to do things and move them in a right direction so that those people do not get left behind because they're part of our community.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up, Sandy, because it's important to keep our understanding of the whole complexity. So I'm calling you into participating today from Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan has some of the most successful active corporations in the country. You'll know about Whitecap and Desnodé and the La Ronge Indian Band has a wonderful Kitsaki active corporation. They're very, very successful. 15% of the Saskatchewan population and 70% of the prison population. Mm-hmm. It's exactly what you're describing. And these things are existing in parallel. But what you're saying is, as you expand the economic opportunities, you're going to lessen this pressure over here because you have to give people an alternative. Yeah. And I think if you go back 30 years, there wasn't much of an alternative. The companies wouldn't hire an Aboriginal person. The banks wouldn't loan money to an Aboriginal person. Getting a license was very difficult. You couldn't mortgage your land on the reserve. There were so many barriers going on. Wayne asked a question for us today that I want to sort of get your response to. It's a bit of a long question, but he says this about reconciliation. It's clear that reconciliation in our industry, oil and gas sector, is fluid. And in my position, I see offering differing resource clients not having a clear definition or idea of what engagement should look like on their projects. In other words, they want to do it, they don't know what it is they're supposed to do. Saying that, is there any organization working with Indigenous owners trying to better define inclusion on their projects? Who's getting it right?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things associated to that, and again, part of it is having that safe space where we can just be honest and look in the mirror and stuff. If we look at a lot of the leadership, and I'll pick on the oil and gas sector, if we look at a lot of the leadership, there are a lot of non-Indigenous leaders in the C-suite and board. I pay kudos to again Suncor here. They've had a First Nation person on their board for years and years and years and years. And you know what? I can honestly say, I think that is what makes a difference. I think it opens up a narrative. It opens up a perspective in terms of how, businesses move forward. I think right now, companies will, I often say, if you take a non-Indigenous person's narrative on rights, it's going to be very different than a person's narrative who has an understanding of culture, who comes from community, that perspective. And I think that we miss out on that activity. What I can say is we are seeing, the interesting thing, and I guess the sector we haven't talked about really is the banks. And we really don't talk about the banks quite a bit when we talk about the oil sands. We often talk about, the industry. But if you go and look at the tickers of these oil and gas companies, you'll find that the largest banks in Canada are, make up the top investors. And so they are hugely invested into the oil and gas. They're also huge financiers of the oil and gas industry. And so if you look at what they're doing, from a reconciliation perspective, some of it's really aggressive. And the thing is that when you look at the economics of it all, it makes sense that it's very aggressive because they've got skin in the game as well too. They want to make sure that what they're doing is sustainable for the future, is making sense. They also want to make sure that the companies they're investing in are also doing what they're saying they're doing and continue to move that forward. So, it isn't just looking at the oil and gas companies, but the one company, and I apologize for keep throwing them out here, but, I go back to the Syncrude and the Suncor. Proportionately, their spend is about double everybody else's in the region. I don't think a lot of people know that. And it's easy to figure out. Just open up an annual report, do the calculations, and you can figure out. So proportionately they're double on the Indigenous side of what their spend is to other areas. They've been at it for a longer time as well. But I think a huge difference, they're part of the social fabric of the communities that we live in. I think that is so huge. They're not just fly in, fly out folks. These are people. At our last NABA event, we had two vice presidents from Syncrude sitting right there at the very end of the show. Andrew and Ken came over, and said, hello, let's get together. That's the level of relationship that we're talking about. I think that's super important. If we want to, try to, I sometimes, my kids are all grown up now, but I used to say, you can't parent from the couch. You got to get involved, you got to get down and you got to be, building that relationship with your kids. And, and I think, a relationship is what's really important. I think some of the problems is sometimes corporations or organizations will try to build their program in isolation. And I think that's a huge risk. I think we need to be talking and involving the communities that they're going to be impacting and having those conversations and letting them be a part of it, because you know what, there's a good chance that they've got probably a lot of the answers that you don't have within your companies just because they have that level. If I think back to university, I remember when they were teaching us, the goal of a company is to maximize shareholder equity, and so many people walk away going, oh yeah, money. But, as I often say to people, you've also got to keep in mind, we talk about low prices. Well, low prices often come at a cost to something or someone, and when we look at Indigenous communities, I'm not going to set up a hardware store today, here in Sherwood Park in between Costco and Walmart. It's just not going to happen, so we really need to be able to, deal with realities. But again, I definitely would look at the banks. Scotiabank has just launched a strong initiative. I also I know Royal Bank has also recently launched. You're starting to see companies. Synovus is really driving, that Indigenous perspective. And so, but from our perspective as NABA, we want to be part of those discussions with them. We want to help you because right now the focus is so primarily on the nations. And that's where a lot of the funding goes towards, so there's people that say, oh, you're lucky, you're Indigenous, you get all this millions of dollars. And it's like, well, no, I don't. That's for the nations. But we got to keep in mind, a lot of the nations aren't necessarily, stacked with entrepreneurs. And so we also need to respect that even as Indigenous people, we are part of that community. And in fact, as Indigenous people, we are becoming interdependent. We are no longer requiring, that dependency on our nations in terms of our living. We've kind of stepped out and bridged out and kind of liberated ourselves. And so we need to recognize the power of that, in terms of making sure that we support the one as well. Because when you look at even the numbers and the spend, some companies are like at 5%. Suncor is at 20% as an Aboriginal spend. Well, that's still 80% opportunities. Like, what is in that 80% that we ought to be looking at? That we can be talking about. Doing something totally different. And who knows? Maybe we end up owning some and building some company that we can go to Australia with and partner, or New Zealand and partner with the Maori down there to do what they're doing. Like it's limitless, but we need to be able to sit down and have these conversations and to be able to, like I say, kind of check our fear and our ego in at the door.
My sense, Sandy, that, and you may be the one who does this, I think 25 years from now, an Indigenous group will own Suncor or the equivalent. They'll own some of these big companies. And I want to get your thought to one thing. I did some research one time where I was asking leaders in the oil and gas industry sort of what was most successful about their outreach activity and how do they get to know community? How did you get to know people, right? And they all basically said the same thing that you were saying, that you have to be there. Don't take your suit off. Don't show up for an hour-long meeting and leave right away. Stay overnight. Go to the feast. That kind of stuff. Be in the community. But the one thing that really struck out was 3 or 4 of the CEOs said the most significant thing that they did was when they first started working with the community. They went there and they said, "Can you get one of the elders to take me out on the land?" And the elders actually just took them fishing or hunting. They just went out down the rivers and up into the hills and all this kind of stuff, right? And they came back with such a powerful sense of what the territory meant to the community, which you can't get in the community. The community is a government creation. The individual reserve communities, the government created those things in Northern Alberta, most of them some of them as late as the 1870s and 1880s or early 20th century. Those are not traditional Indigenous places. And so these CEOs when they came back and they said, okay, you cannot be with an elder on the land and fail to understand how significant the land is to this community. And so their concept of stewardship and obligation exploded overnight. Your thoughts?
It reminds me, using a similar model with the RCMP. So, if you look at, policing in Indigenous communities, and if you take some of the research of Paulo Freire and you look at, is some of our training, do we dehumanize people, to go into certain areas? And what you will see and I hope I don't get anyone in trouble for this, is you will see RCMP, like years ago, they would wear their jeans and their RCMP shirt, and that is it. And the radio, that was it. And the thing is because what they would do is they would humanize themselves. They would become part of the community. And what would happen is, unfortunately, that person would get moved to another person. Well, what would we see? Well, we'd see the next police person would show up, with the Kevlar jacket, the glasses, the gloves on, and we're like, oh no, we're in trouble here. But in short time, you would see that those people would humanize themselves and become part of the social fabric, and they would be received so differently than how they were prior. And I say that, and it's the same thing from the corporate side of things, and there's massive value in just what you've said.
So that's a great example of the RCMP, and I've been in the communities with both kinds of police officers there, and boy, are they ever different in terms of their sense of comfort and confidence and whatever. I would ask you, we've only got a few more minutes, and this may be the last question, I'm not sure. Maybe we'll try to get one more in from one of our folks, but just really quickly, when I look across Canada, a lot of Indigenous communities are still focusing their expectations on the world of, let's say, 1990 or 2000, where you just started to get a bit of a sense of Indigenous power and self-government was treaties were being signed, et cetera, et cetera. In the last 20 years, we have major settlements on treaties. We have court decisions that have things like the duty to consult and accommodate. We now have UNDRIP. We have very dramatic, bold federal promises about reconciliation and collaboration and whatever else. To what degree are the First Nations and Métis communities expecting enough from the industry and from society as a whole? It seems to me that there's a lot of unrealized rights, unrealized potential, unrealized opportunity.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's for myself, I when I was taking some grad school classes, and really it was when I started to look at some of the oppression side of things in terms of kind of where we've come, what we've been experienced, systemic racism. I think that we need to be comfortable talking about that more and more. I use an analogy, systemic racism is like the wind. You can feel it, but you can't see it. And I think for a lot of people, they don't know that, the decisions that they're involved with, necessarily make an impact in terms of what's involved. But I think the biggest thing is having that comfort level of Indigenous people and getting to a level where Canadians are comfortable looking and saying, it's all right, if the smartest person in the room is Indigenous. It's all right if the smartest, if the richest person in the room is Indigenous. We're not, we're not used to that yet.
Yes.
I remember years ago, I was down in Calgary and I was at a meeting, and this person, I don't know what we were talking about, but they were so impressed with our discussion, and their remarks were, "Oh my gosh, you are the smartest Indigenous and she stopped there. And I said, "I'm the smartest Indigenous person you've ever met." Like, your standards are low, first of all. But the second thing is that, I probably could have really, gotten upset. But I also recognize the fact that, she comes from a place of ignorance as well.
Yep.
She's trying to pay us, a compliment, but she comes from a place of ignorance. And I think that that's where we really need to go. You talk about the 90s when I first started going to school down in the Edmonton area. I had about six people that I went to school with that told me that I get a free truck. And it's like, oh yeah, no, you get a free truck. Go to Wetaskiwin, and pick up your free truck, and that's not fair. It's on my tax dollars. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm not from that nation. You're talking to somebody. I said, it's like going to the Scottish and complaining and calling them out as the French. I said, yes, we're Cree. I said, but we're of different nations and such. So, I think really what we need to be able to do is to create an environment where it's okay for us to be able to talk about our rights. It's okay for us to be able to strategize. I think sometimes the challenge is that as Indigenous people, and certainly for myself, you always know you have rights, but you just don't know what they are. And I think that, with the use of the resources that are available and the conversations, is that, we can get to that place. We still have, scenarios where, and I know what it feels like as an Indigenous person. I'll say to people, it's okay for unions to advocate for their rights, but as soon as you do it as an Indigenous person, people go, "Oh, you're using the Indigenous card," and it's like, no, but we need to be able to get comfortable having discussions about where we've been in the past. One of the best things I've ever heard is my in-laws were in Germany visiting some friends, and they said, in Germany, they teach the kids about the Holocaust so it doesn't happen again. And I thought, that is so profound and makes sense. I look at my education. I knew more about the Roman Empire than I did about my own culture, coming out of high school. And I think that, we need to look at some of those areas in terms of, educating ourselves and having, comfortable conversations about it.
Listen, we're going to have time for one really quick last question. It's really right on target for you. You're going to love it. But I also do want to say that I think the point at which Canadians overcome their disbelief about an Aboriginal wealthy person is when we're really have turned a corner. Yeah. I hear this all the time. If you see somebody who's wealthy, they'll say, "Oh, they're ripping off the system," or they got some money from their chief or something like that. I mean, I know a lot of wealthy Aboriginal people. They earned every single cent.
Absolutely.
And they earned it from the time they were 3 years old with all the garbage they put up with in school and everywhere else, right? Yeah. So here's your last question.
Okay.
The Northeast Alberta Aboriginal Business Association, this is from Denise, was a leader in Canada, if not North America, in breaking the glass ceiling for Indigenous businesses. Yeah. David Tukuro, David and Nicole Boucher, and the Goloskis have all been leaders. What is your organization trying to do to continue to push the glass ceiling even higher? And that's a great question to end on, and we only have about 1.5 minutes.
You know what? I will say all those people are phenomenal. If you ever get a chance to meet any of them, they are all just amazing people. I think they have really been pioneers in terms of moving that forward. They've demonstrated that Indigenous people are smart, that we're driven, that we're able to compete against the best of the best. I think that, they've really kind of raised that bar. I think what we need to be careful of is not to say, okay, well, look at these people, let's check off a box and say, okay, we've accomplished it, because we have new generations of entrepreneurs that are coming forward. We have new technologies that are coming forward. We have new challenges that are coming forward. So what we need to continue to do is we need to continue to look at, and I think if you look at all of them, they're likely going to say, I know a couple of them will say that they were given an opportunity. They were given an opportunity from industry in the region that said, you know what, we want you to do this. And those opportunities are super, super important for NABA. They're super important for us. I'm a big believer of joint ventures, but I don't think you can hang your hat on a joint venture unless you're going to run and buy out that joint venture in the long run. But I think that, I think they were definitely pioneers right across Canada in terms of, being able to say that, what, we can do that. And yeah, they're all, amazing people in terms of what they do and contribute back to the community as well too. So we're very, very lucky to have them all as role models for all of us in the region and Canada. And, regardless if you're Indigenous or not.
Well, Sandy, I know you want us to know that you're one of those role models.
Oh, thank you.
As an entrepreneur, but also as somebody who devotes a huge portion of your life to creating opportunities for other Aboriginal people and for educating non-Aboriginal people and governments in sort of the world that's unfolding in front of us. And part of me as an historian, I look back and think, boy, we've come a long way. But the other part is to realize we're sort of just out of the starting blocks in a 100-yard race. Yeah. Pat ourselves on the back, but not too much.
Absolutely.
Right? Most of the race is still in front of us, and the part where you start getting tired is still down the road. So, Sandy, this was a magnificent interview. I love talking to you. I think you gave a phenomenal perspective on the opportunities, the barriers, the challenges. And one of the things I'm sure that our audience took away from this is the powerful sense of optimism and commitment that you have. I think if people walk away from this with anything, it is the fact that Aboriginal people are hardworking, determined. They really want to make a real success out of their own lives, out of their own businesses, and out of their own communities. So Absolutely. With your leadership, we're going to see even more of that in the years to come.
Well,
thank you. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. Sandy Sanderson was a fantastic guest. Thank you for being part of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's sort of ongoing series on Indigenous economic opportunity. We are here basically committed to the idea of creating more opportunity and with making sure that folks like Sandy Sanderson have the best possible platform for their ideas and their values. Thanks again, Sandy, and thanks to all of you for participating.